Hi, I'm SJ.
And I'm Pegsy. Welcome to our Heels in the Hierarchy podcast, where we discuss the experiences and challenges faced by working women today. Join us as we explore a range of topics from navigating career advancement to balancing work and personal life without stepping on toes.
Each episode features relevant topics, inspiring stories, and practical advice to empower women on their professional journey. Maybe you're a single parent to teenagers and have a high-maintenance dog, you care for elderly relatives, or are simply spinning plates outside work too.
You'll gain new perspectives, practical strategies, and have the reassurance that even seemingly accomplished women leaders face challenges similar to yours.
In each series, we'll share career journeys and expert insights with occasional guests. Like you, they weren't born leaders, and their paths weren't always smooth. You'll hear about their stumbles and successes, their mentors and motivators, and the pivotal moments that shaped their careers, revealing the real person behind the polished exterior.
We hope you'll laugh, learn, and enjoy different perspectives around women in work and leadership and all that it entails. So step into an episode of Heels in the Hierarchy, the place where we explore current challenges and opportunities and share extraordinary insights for ordinary women, one conversation at a time.
Today we are talking about mental health and work. It's World Mental Health Day today. It's celebrated every year on the 10th of October. This year's theme is set by the World Federation of Mental Health, and it's workplace mental health. This highlights the importance of addressing mental health and well-being in the workplace for the benefit of people, organisations and communities. Today, we're going to be talking about it, signs and symptoms, and how to have some tips and tricks about how you can support yourself in the workplace and why it's so important as a leader to support those that you are leading.
I think before we get into that in too much detail, I think it's just worth quoting these stats, which I found really surprising and not surprising.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that gives some context for the size of this issue and will help some of those things resonate. So one of the things that I was surprised by, around 1 in 6 people in England experience symptoms of mental health problems during any given week. 1 in 6 in any given week. Obviously, there's potential for stress in all aspects of our lives. We've all got loads of plates that we're spinning. But the other thing that I found really surprising was that the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, found that more than 17 million workdays were taken off due to mental health, workplace-related stress, anxiety or depression between 2022 and 2023. So that's 17 million workdays. But those are stress-related workdays taken off. I think that figure probably is quite an understatement because we know that people take days off suffering from stress that they don't attribute to stress.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I think when you think about, if we're all honest, even if we're not in a leadership position, we can still feel stress. Like as human natures, I think if you go back to how we were cavemen and women, you'd see something, your brain tells you there's a threat. You deal with the threat and then it's gone. Yeah. Our modern day is not the same way, but our brains are still formulated in the same way. So the way that we hold stress, the way that we see threat, it's more difficult to be able to hold that because we've got stress all the time than we did when we were cavemen.
So the amount of stress has increased, but the evolution of the human being dealing with that stress has not happened at the same rate as the amount of stress that we're dealing with.
Yeah, or just being able to cope of how we don't recognise what a threat and not threat is. So it could be stress, it could be something else, but the psychological response and the physiological response is exactly the same. A lot about people is recognising signs of stress in your body. Because we are so different in the way that we deal with stress, sometimes your body has to go into physical mode to teach you what's going on because you're so used to the day-to-day stresses that you're not recognising stress as stress anymore because you go, well, I'm always stressed. There's always demands on me.
There's always
something going on.
Yeah.
But you'll suddenly have a migraine, for example.
Yeah.
Or you'll suddenly not be able to sleep because your mind's not able to switch on. Or you'll have this really bad tension in your shoulders and you just think, oh, that's just because of the way positioning and sitting at work. However, that's your body's trying to give you signals all the time. And I think sometimes we forget how good our bodies are at giving you signals of just be careful, I'm getting stressed, I'm holding stress, because we don't recognize, or in my experience, see the importance of our physical being and our psychological well-being on the impact of how we feel.
So when the psychological signals become full because they've been ignored, that's kind of when the physical symptoms kind of start to kick in.
Yeah, like for example, so one of the things that I started teaching people was, even before you start work, driven somewhere, before you even get to a place, you've had so much, you had to get up, you've had to do, you have to sort out, you've had traffic, you've had noise, you've had all these overwhelming senses, but then you're rushing straight into a task. So you haven't even paused to recognize the impact it has on your body. So when you do a really good stretch, or when you kind of breathe properly, the whole reason we've had to be so conscious about taking a breath, pausing, because you need to start thinking about how you recognize stress in your body. So people will just talk, oh, really bad neck ache, or I'm really feeling that in my shoulders. I know for myself, I absolutely hold stress in my shoulders. And what I noticed is that I wasn't conscious that my shoulders go up when I'm stressed. Right. Because I'm holding it so much. So I'm physically holding the stress on my shoulders as I'm carrying a weight. But I never noticed that before until I had physical symptoms of shoulder pain and neck pain. And actually that was because, when I was really honest, I was carrying so much stress of pressures that actually I didn't do anything about it. I just took it as normal. So I think recognizing our physical pain and our physical way of dealing with things, or signals, which is different. So some people will have consistent migraines, or not be able to sleep at night, or their concentration would be slightly off, or they're not as focused. We are very good at brushing these things off and accepting stress, rather than actually saying, oh, how do we flip that to say that as humans, we are not designed to be under so much stress on a daily basis.
And therefore what you're saying is we're thinking about stress through a different lens. We're not seeing it as stress. As I've just realised, I was about to say as peaks and troughs of everyday life, but I've realised that we assume that stress is almost like a different chapter, the end of something, not stress, and then stress. Whereas actually what you're saying is stress is ongoing in everyday life and in everything that we do. And at times the amount of stress increases to such a level that it then becomes something more that we need to be more attuned to. So it's not a black and white thing. It's a constant thing. But
I think the concepts are so good. So mental health first aid, and how when we think about concepts, they always talk about, I call it, when I'm talking to people, leaky buckets. But I think they call it as a container. Everyone has a stress container. We feel stress, but we don't see it as stress. So we always have things, wake up, you have an argument, or you get up and there's things aren't happening, or you're not quite at that deadline. But that's part, we have this language and narrative that we say, oh, this is part of the job, or this is part of the job. We expect that things can be quite challenging, and we use that as a stress. Oh, it's busy. Of course, that's going to be stressful, or I've got a deadline. But actually, all those things have a knock-on impact. If you have a stressful day, a really stressful day, you're not your whole perfect, authentic, open self, because you just need to focus and you've got things on. If that is going consistently, and then suddenly you're not sleeping well, you're having more and more irritability because actually you're not sleeping well and therefore you can't perform, or there's impacts in your relationships. These are always little signs that actually your stress bucket is overfilling. Right. You're not restoring yourself. So there is a ability to be in tune with yourself, to not only understand what is happening in your physical body, but what's happening in your environment, and therefore thinking about the impact that it has on your mental health in your environment. So if your environment's not great, you're going to work and you're feeling stressed. You're coming home and you're stressed. Yeah. Your relationships are going to be impacted, but you're not doing anything to nurture yourself. That leaky bucket is going to constantly overflow. Yeah. And that's going to impact your work, which is what you're getting stressed about, because you need to be doing your work to pay the bills, etc. So it's a constant cycle. Thinking about how workplace responds to those stats are quite important, if not vital, when we're thinking about being attuned to ourselves and therefore attuned to our colleagues and our the people that we manage, because if we don't know what stresses them, we could be adding to their stress bucket without even knowing that actually we're potentially causing more harm. And that's a huge responsibility, I think.
One of the things I did when I took on a new team was I used a template, which I think I got from Mental Health England.
Mm-hmm.
We can put a copy of it in the links below, record what their stressors were. And I did that with every single member of my team. So before I'd formed potentially a preconception about what they were like, but also before they were stressed.
Yes. And that's absolutely key. I think that any strategies, you have to have strategies that work, but you only can do it when you're not in that state.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you can't practice something when you're in that heightened state. So when you think about someone having a panic attack, if they've got no strategies that they practice when they're calm, it's not going to come innately, naturally to you when you're doing it. So telling someone to calm down when they're really stressed is the worst thing you can say, because they've got no strategies, they haven't practiced it.
Yeah.
And then you're asking them to do something that they can't audibly think about because they're in such a shutdown mode. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. Having discussions around what makes somebody feel stressed or what things can they do, and giving permission for people to practice that is so important.
And the other thing that I did was I adapted the organisation's one-to-one form to try and put in some open questions about how they were feeling in every single one-to-one meeting. And what I did was on each time we met, instead of doing a new form every time, I added the notes of that conversation to the notes from the previous conversation. To me, demonstrated that I valued the exchanges, but also to recognise that your response to a particular situation was dynamic. It varied depending on where you were.
Yeah. But I think that also then causes challenges for those who would see work as that's not a place that you would talk about stresses, because actually we have to also recognise that although work has a massive impact on our day-to-day stresses, there are those that we're going to potentially support and manage that are they close off from any personal perspective or don't want to think about the personal feelings, they're outcome focused or whatever. But I think this is why workplaces have had a shift in thinking that staff wellbeing, the way that we have to understand our staff and having strategies and open discussions is the only way forward to take the stigma away that we can't expect people to be running at 100 miles an hour and perform high, because everyone has different things in their life going on. It doesn't mean you have to share that in your one-to-ones or think about it, but we do encourage that two-way conversation because it enables us to understand who we're supporting. So I do think having strategies and tips and things that can be constantly in conversations, even if someone doesn't want to talk about it, saying, actually, I know you said about, I noticed you talked about this and how does that impact that? But also sometimes if people are shutting off, and I've had people that absolutely talk, I can't even say the word now, but will not talk about anything that's not specifically written, that is not about work.
Right.
But actually it's my role as a leader to say, well, actually what I've noticed about your behaviour here is X, Y and Z. I'm concerned that this is going to be taking too much of your time away from home or being able to do that. I'm putting that into the space. And if they still shut down, I'll go, I just want to let you know that there's all these resources if you feel that's available. So we still are guiding and signposting people. And I do think that having a topic, I know it's just a day, I went to on workplace, it's still a massive encouragement working forward because our work has a huge impact on both our personal lives and vice versa.
And I think one of the interesting things that you mentioned there is persevering and normalizing discussions about well-being, even when a person is perhaps not comfortable opening up. I'd guess that the more that you normalize that in one-to-ones and that you do it with everyone in your team, the more that they will get a sense of trust that if they then feel comfortable to share something with you, that they will be heard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I've picked up probably more so is it goes back to understanding your team, but also when it comes to demonstrating, when we think about stress as underperforming, we're thinking about, we talk about outcomes driven, or we're thinking about got to do a task. it's not sometimes the ability to be able to fulfill that, but they're so distracted by everything else. And sometimes you automatically get into a sense of overwhelm without feeling that you're overwhelmed. And therefore what happens is that you just shut down, or you're not performing as people would expect or think of you as being your normal self. And it's a leadership's responsibility to just check in. You know, they may shut down and go, I'm absolutely fine. But I think you're right in terms of the consistency of going, I'm concerned with that, is because actually you said you'll do this, but this is not your normal self. Like, why didn't you respond to that one? I'm curious about that. And sometimes often is that for people who are over-analyzers and think about it, it's very easy to take things and mask things at work and then take that home and think about it. And then what happens, that impacts your sleep because you're so wired, because you're over-analysing your day, that's why people ruminate. And ruminate is thinking something over and over and over again in your mind. And it's your own belief and thought. So if I did really badly in an interview, or if I didn't do well doing a presentation, it's very easy to distract yourself again. I just said the same thing. Why do I'm not able to articulate? That's the usual self. And all the things that I would think about people said over me about that, that's something that I'd keep playing over. And before you know it, you go into the self loop. And actually, my biggest tip would be the only way to get out of that rumination, because your thought is your own belief, and then your own belief becomes something that's your core belief, and you kind of like record player, and you're kind of saying the same thing. But until you say it out loud and you audibly hear yourself or write it down, that rumination cannot be broken. So you are constantly playing something that actually can be more damaging. You're not switching off because you're ruminating on the thought that's making you feel bad, which is also causing more stress. So therefore, writing something down, and why people are encouraged to have a diary or having a piece of paper or recording something, because when you hear it out loud, it's so much easier to be able to challenge that belief or not.
So if I have been for a job interview, and I've not done well, in my opinion, and I get in my head and I rerun that interview over and over, and I tell myself how rubbish it is, and then I remind myself how rubbish I am at interviews. I say to myself out loud, no, you're not rubbish at interviews. Or do I write it down and say you're not rubbish at interviews?
You just write all your thoughts out.
So even if I'm saying Pegsy, you're really rubbish at interviews, even if I'm writing negative words down.
But you're not writing necessarily negative words. What you're doing is you're challenging your thoughts.
Right.
Because you're in your head, you've got that, you're audibly playing this interview that is reinforcing the thought processes of what you said. By writing down your day and saying this is what's happened, you're not sitting there going, I am rubbish, I'm reinforcing negativity. What you're doing is throwing, if I'm ruminating on the stress of my day and are thinking of that, what you're doing is you're thinking in your own mind is reinforcing your thoughts and beliefs of what you have of yourself, and that's becoming your core belief, and that's reinforcing your core belief of what you really feel about yourself.
Right.
Once you write down all the things that happened in your day and what you're feeling and how you're feeling, you're not saying yes you are or no you're not. You're writing down your thoughts and processes, and in doing so, you're able to challenge that and go, I was really good at doing that. And you don't even have to do that. Often it's just what you're feeling is what you're feeling in the moment. I think what you're saying is about over-analysing and overthinking. Am I reinforcing my negative thoughts? But actually, when you're in your head, you can play whatever thing you want in your head. Right. But when you're writing it down, it doesn't come out like that. You're just writing your thoughts and feelings out. And it's actually about breaking the cycle of the thinking process.
So the physical act of writing your thoughts down removes your thoughts from inside your head where they're locked in that space. You're kind of like freeing your thoughts through the process of writing your thoughts down. Even if your thoughts start negatively to begin with, the practice of writing it down will actually free your brain's capacity to go, no, you're not. Don't be so daft.
Or even sometimes what I do is video record myself, because people hate video things, but sometimes just talking out loud. you're not saying the thought, because before you're consciously knowing it, you are just talking your thoughts out loud. So this is my day, and you're just having a conversation out loud and you're processing it out loud.
Right.
So you're not really sitting there writing the thought that you're thinking when you're ruminating, because the ruminating is one thought. What you're doing is the process of writing. You're processing your actual thinking, which is a complete shift to then thinking of one thing that is allowing yourself to record play and then sticking into that moment. But the impact we talk about here is by not sleeping and ruminating on something that is causing you stress, like I am not going to finish this presentation, I haven't got this time. It's less about you, but the stress of that feeling is panic, because you're feeling that time is running out and we're not going to be able to do it. It's just causing stress, which is keeping you awake. And therefore you either have different responses to that. So you either stay up all night trying to do it, and therefore you're exhausted and don't do well.
Got you.
Or you keep yourself away and just, it's very difficult to kind of shift that thinking.
Yeah.
So, but the impact of that stress is then it causes you realising that actually you're not going to perform well at work.
You have just reminded me of something that I did. I worked in an organisation. We had a change event going on and I was not happy with how that was unfolding. I went to bed reasonably late, deliberately, so that I was tired and I would sleep. I slept briefly and then I woke up, because even though I'd gone to bed ridiculously tired, it was still in my head and it was playing on a loop in my head. So I actually got up and switched my computer on at 4:00 in the morning and I wrote the email from hell. Now don't ever do that and send an email. So I remembered that and I actually wrote it as a Word document, knowing that I was in my head and that I was never going to send this. But you've just reminded me, I sat there and for about half an hour, 45 minutes, I composed in a Word document an email that I knew I was never going to send, but I got it all out. And then I did go back to sleep. So that's essentially what you're saying, is it's releasing all of those demons, putting it down, getting it out there, and then letting it go.
It goes back to another conversation around, we would never allow our loved ones and people that we know, our peers, to speak about themselves than we do ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's a thought that you'd have around that. If I was telling you like, oh, absolutely awful and I am this and I am that, you'd be challenging my thinking.
Yes.
Because actually you wouldn't allow me to be so unkind on myself, because actually you'd know me. And so therefore, doing that in that process is just getting those thoughts out to break that cycle of allowing you to carry on, because that's what causes anxiety. And that if you're really not careful, you keep staying in that mode, that's what starts causing depression, because you're not actually being able to challenge your thinking and writing it down, because you're just me, myself and I. Yeah, I can think whatever I want about myself and I can challenge those thinking, but I've got everything in my back diary to reinforce my thinking and reinforce my core beliefs based on what I feel and think, and it's all me, where actually in reality that's not what we have. So I think when we go back to kind of the stress of the workplace, having people and having good conversations and opening the conversations is so healthy. Even if people find the word like mental health difficult still, but actually we think about well-being and having techniques and things is recognizing and tuning in with our bodies. Where does our stress hold? You know, are we okay with having conversations? And actually businesses have a lot of, and actually making sure we have good rituals around sleep, around making sure that we are looking after our bodies, our mind is so important to the way that how impactful we are in the workplace. A lot of companies would have an employee assistance program, which they actually invest in to ensure that staff have access to free. And I think a lot of people think it's counselling, but they do have six sessions of free counselling. But they also do around debt advice. They also do about family support. And they have reams of support and tips and trips of how to think about things. So I think that's so important to ask your employer, you know, do you have an employee assistance program? What is that? How do I access that? Make sure that's inductions. You know, a lot of workplaces also have, especially bigger organisations, have mental health first aiders now, which is about recognising the psychological impacts of work. But actually, if someone's in crisis, in a mental health crisis, where to signpost to. So everyone's got somewhere to do that. And even on the Mental Health First Aid England, they've got masses of resources for employers and for leaders to utilise and think about. So I'd absolutely encourage people to look at what is our workplace policy around mental health? How do I have a conversation? And if you're finding it difficult, speak to a peer. How would I have a conversation about that? What is important to you into being successful in your well-being, and what's your stressors? And I think that's really important. You mentioned it earlier about knowing what our stresses are and being able to identify them early before we get to that stage, and having accountability. I'm noticing you're struggling here. What is that about?
And we can put some of those resources in the notes below.
Yeah.
I think for me, some of my takeaways are talk to your team about their well-being and their stress. Do you say stresses?
Yeah, that, what is their stresses? And when we mean stresses is what things causes them stress, because stress can look different.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we understand that from our team as individuals before they get into a situation where we need to support them.
Yeah.
As a good manager, we're aware of places to signpost staff to, policies and procedures for the organisation and the employee assistance programs in organisations that offer it. We're aware of external resources such as things from Mental Health First Aid England, for example, and we can put some other links in there. And then for ourselves, we treat ourselves as if we were a best friend to ourselves, where we challenge negative thoughts and be as kind to ourselves as we would be to a friend sharing those negative thoughts. And a really great tip that you talked about was about getting the stuff that's in your head out of your head, either through saying it out loud, recording it on a voice note, or writing it down.
Yeah.
Any other hints and tips that you want to share with us?
I think, again, it's about encouraging people to be attuned and be self-aware.
Yeah.
Be aware of what your stresses are, but in that, also having a healthy routine.
Yeah.
So I think there's some great resources, Mental Health First Aid England as well, where it talks about your routine of getting up, things that you could do to almost protective factors around your work day, stress, of making sure you take your breaks. I think that's something that we forget. We often work through our breaks still. We're trying to do things, but actually that has a negative impact on the productivity of our work. So making sure that we are going for 5-minute walks, going for 10, take a colleague with you to process your morning is so useful, and someone that you trust in order to process that bit out loud to then get you into your next bit. And then having somebody that is your go-to or your buddy at work that you can process. So if you don't have things like supervision or reflective practice, have a buddy system that actually people that you trust and your peers that you can reflect on the impact of your work. And they could be your encouragers and they can be your buddies to go, I think you need to go talk about that, because actually you're more likely to talk to somebody that you know and that you trust about your issues or concerns around stress than you would about your manager in your first place. So having more rituals in your day enables you to take a moment to become self-aware. And becoming self-aware of your stresses means you're more likely to put those preventative stuff in that would cause you to then go off on stress.
Brilliant. I think there's some really fantastic hints and tips there. Any final thoughts as we sort of bring our session about World Mental Health Day to an end?
No, I think just we've talked about a lot of it, but I think, I absolutely encourage everyone to look at all the resources that we're going to put in there around bringing your whole self to work, about the mental health first aid, having mental health first aid aiders, and keep the conversation going. We've had it as Mental Health First Aid Day around looking at work and the stresses of work, but actually this is an everyday stress. So having a day to talk about it just means that actually we need to be talking about it every day. So I encourage people to make it their day to day is my kind of key growth. So thank you very much. Lovely to listen and talk about it.
Brilliant. I look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on Heels in the Hierarchy with SJ
and Pegsy. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please spread the word and share it with your work bestie, your mentor, or anyone with their heels in the hierarchy.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you could spare a moment to leave us a review, it helps our other ambitious women find our community.
Find us on LinkedIn and Instagram for more content and behind-the-scenes glimpses.
Until next time, keep your heels high and your standards higher.